So many buttons. We talked about a little bit more about the cellular structure and function. We talked about what is a cell, why we have a lot of different small cells, why they have specific tasks, why we're not just one big cell. We talked about that surface area to volume ratio. We talked about the prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. Remember, those prokaryotic cells are the simple, they are bacteria, algae, things like that. Eukaryotic cells being animal cells, plant cells that are complex. We talked about what they had in common and what they had that were contrasting. We also talked about how cells are organized. We talked about how things come across that plasma membrane. We also talked about how enzymes work and that metabolic reaction. And we talked about what cellular respiration is. So today, talking about chapter 4, we're going to get into a little bit bigger thinking. So we started off with atoms and molecules, and we progressed to cells, and now we have some things called organs and tissues. If you remember that picture from chapter 2 that kind of broke it down all the way down to an atom, all the way up to a biosphere or an ecosystem, we're kind of in the middle right now. We're going to talk about how some specific cells come together to make tissues. And these tissues make up organs. Your organs are what you maybe kind of think of already, your heart, your lungs, things like that. But we're going to talk about the tissues or the specialized cells that come together that make up those organs. We're going to talk about what the 4 main types of tissues are and what they look like, what's their function, where are they found. We're going to talk about the integumentary system. We're going to talk about skin cancer and how you can prevent it. It has something to do with that integumentary system. And what is homeostasis and how is it maintained for the specific organ systems. So I kind of talked about what a tissue is already. It's a collection of cells that have a specific function that is similar to one another. So there are 4 types of tissues in the body, and all of the tissues can fall into these 4 categories. There's a flow chart. I think it's either on the next slide or 2 slides. So it's 2 slides from now that'll really be helpful when determining what the different types of tissues are. So the 4 major tissue types in the body, the first is connective tissue. And we'll talk about connective tissue. This is the thing that binds and supports all of your body. It specializes in kind of like protein fibers and how things are connected throughout the body, which is why it's called connective tissue. Muscular tissue seems to be fairly common. We'll talk about smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue that make up the muscles that you may use every day. The nervous tissue makes up the nervous system, and then epithelial tissue is that last one. So these are the 4 different types of tissues. The next couple of slides are going to break down each of these categories. So first we have connective tissue. It binds and supports parts of the body. Okay, there are 3 main types of connective tissue. So if you were to make kind of a flow chart, and number 1 being connective, under that, the 3 categories of connective are fibrous, supportive, and fluid. These are the ground substance and protein fibers that come together to make up the matrix of the tissue. This is a kind of a complicated one to explain because it's a tissue that we all have, but we don't really think about it very much. It ranges from solid to fluid, and we'll talk about some of those here in a second. So some examples, if you like this flow chart, I recommend remembering this page or this slide. It's slide 6. We have those 3 main types of connective tissue. We have fibrous, supportive, and fluid. So here at the top, you can see we have the 3 types of connective tissue. You have 1, 2, and 3 different types of those connective tissue. Under fibrous, the different types of fibrous tissue that you can have are loose and dense. The loose fibrous connective tissue creates a loose, open framework, and dense are fibers that are densely packed. that's kind of all you really need to know about this section of fibrous connective tissue, that there's loose and dense. When you think of fibrous connective tissue, think of, when I see the word fiber, fiber being like the things that, well, one, you can find it in vegetables and fruit. People say to eat a high fibrous diet. Your hair or your skin can also be made up of fibrous tissue. And there's different types of fibrous tissue, being loose and dense. The next type of connective tissue is that supportive connective tissue. This one seems a little bit more common. It's supportive. It's that cartilage and your bone. Cartilage is solid yet flexible matrix that's found in like your ear or your nose, and sometimes in your knees and elbows. Bone is exactly what it is, right? It's a solid and rigid matrix. It's the bones in your arms, in your legs, in your skull, in your spine. That's all connective tissue. And the specific types are cartilage and bone. There's a good way to remember that, because your bone and your cartilage support the rest of the things around it. Finally, we have the fluid connective tissue. And this one is what we kind of talked about in lab, and we'll talk more about next week, but blood and lymph. So fluid connective tissue, your blood is fluid, it's a liquid, it's contained in the blood vessels, and your lymph is contained in the lymphatic vessels. Your blood is made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, plasma, and we'll talk about that more next week. And your lymph helps with fighting off infections. These are both fluid-like substances. So the kind of branched subjects of those, we have connective tissue, which is a part of the different types of tissue. The parts of connective tissue are fibrous, supportive, and fluid. And of those, you have loose, dense, cartilage, bone, blood, and lymph. These are all types of connective tissues.
Professor?
Yeah.
I think Luca has internet issue and he tried to get in, so could you please let him in?
Yes. Thank you. Should work now. Okay, thanks for letting me know. So that first one was fibrous connective tissue. Remember, the two types were dense and loose. These contain fibroblast cells with a matrix of collagen and elastic fibers. I think of collagen, it's kind of trendy now to kind of put some collagen in your coffee. I don't know if any of you do that. I don't. But collagen can support your skin and your hair growth and nails. It makes up kind of those fibrous things that I just listed up. Collagen is a protein. It can help kind of give support. People say that when you take a collagen supplement, it helps against wrinkles. I hope we aren't all worried about that quite yet, but those are some of the things that fibrous connective tissue, the loose and dense. The loose fibrous connective tissue can be found in supporting epithelium and many internal organs. So when you think of like your small intestine, large intestine, your stomach, there's some loose fibrous connective tissue that helps make up those different organs. Adipose tissue is a special loose fibrous tissue where fat is stored. So adipose tissue is known as fat. It's special because it is made up of a loose fibrous tissue, but it's also kind of very dense at the same time. So that's why it's a little special. So that's a little bit more about that fibrous connective tissue. Here's an example of what fibrous connective tissue looks like. So here we have an example of an adipose cell. It looks like a little yellow blob. You can find that in your skin, in the layers of your skin, in the layers of your internal organs. Adipose tissue can be found in various areas. There's also a negative kind of stereotype against adipose tissue. We do need it to survive. So while it is kind of the stereotype to have, a low body fat percentage, it's not necessarily the most healthiest thing in the world. Here's a stem cell. That can also be somewhat of a word you may know. Stem cells have been used in a lot of different research. I'm not familiar with a lot of the very specific things about stem cells, but what I know is that they can be used to make other cells. So there's an example of a stem cell right there. collagen fiber. So there's kind of like a light pinkish peach collagen fiber right there. It is unbranched. It is strong but flexible. So I think of like hair and nails. My nails are strong, but they're somewhat flexible. I would say that my nails are more flexible than like the bone in my leg. Ground substance, this feels the substance between cells and fibers. So when we think of that space, that extracellular matrix between all of the cells and all the fibers, that ground substance is kind of like this background color. That's connective tissue that's throughout your body. Elastic fiber is branched and stretchable, which makes sense. When you think of an elastic, like a rubber band or a hair tie, these are branched but flexible. They provide support. Here's an example of a white blood cell, which we talked about kind of with what makes up your blood. It engulfs pathogens and produces antibodies. So your white blood cells help fight off infections. They, like I said, engulfs pathogens, so that would be just like invaders or foreign substances, or it helps produce antibodies, which is another trigger word that we talked about in class. And we talked about how maybe some of you have been known to have the COVID antibodies. Antibodies fight off foreign substances. So there's a couple others here. Reticular fiber is branched and thin. It forms a network. And the fibroblast, it just divides to produce other types of cells. Here's a place in the body where you could find that loose fibrous connective tissue. Like I said, it's in the knee. All right, so here's some of that adipose tissue. That's that kind of yellow, kind of whitish thing in between some of the muscle and the bone here. All right, that elastic fiber, the collagen fiber, the fibroblast, all of those here are considered loose fibrous tissue, and they can be found in the joint of your knee. Okay, we know that bone and cartilage are both also connective tissue, but they are not fibrous connective tissue. So we have the different types of connective tissue. We had fibrous. The next type is supportive connective tissue. The two types are cartilage and bone. Cartilage are cells and chamber. They are made in a lacunae, and this matrix is solid but flexible. So I think of like my ear. My ear has a shape, but I also can kind of bend my ear. Same with my nose. My nose has a shape. It's solid, but it's somewhat flexible. There are 3 different types of cartilage. So another branch off that flow chart would be hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. The location of those can be found under those bullet points right there. The first one there is hyaline cartilage. Like I said, this is in your nose, the ends of long bones, and the fetal skeleton. So we talked about how a sperm and an egg cell come together, they fertilize to produce an embryo. And as that embryo is developing, it doesn't have a developed spine like we do as adults. The embryo and the fetus turn into kind of a hyaline cartilage skeleton, which can be found, like it says, in the fetal skeleton. On the ends of long bones, it's also kind of interesting to start to think about the space between your bones. You've maybe seen a model of a bone, and we'll look at them at the end of this semester. I think it's one of our second to last lab when we talk about bones and muscles. And when I think of a bone model, I think of maybe like a femur. It's a pretty big leg bone, right? But there is space between those bones in the joints. And there's also a little bit of cartilage on the end. The cartilage on the end of the bone helps with the support, but it's also flexible, which is great for the people who have able bodies who can walk, right? That allows me, my knee and my cartilage in my knee allows me to walk, which is definitely a privilege for most people, or it allows me to run or exercise. That cartilage essentially helps with the impact in your knee. You also have it in your elbow and your shoulder and the ends of the long bones. Your elastic cartilage is more elastic fibers than cartilage fibers, and it's located in that outer ear. So the difference, there's different cartilage in my nose than there is in my ear. And then fibrocartilage is that strong collagen fibers. This is the discs between your vertebrae. The next part of the supportive connective tissue is bone. And this is also cells that are in chambers called lacunae. It is solid and rigid matrix that is made up of collagen and calcium salts. Okay, so collagen, there's that word again. It's supporting our bones, like the bones that we talked about, like your femur, your humerus, your radius. And then we have calcium salts. You probably heard when you were a young child, drink your milk, it's good for your teeth and bones, which is true, unless you're lactose intolerant, right? There's other ways that we can find calcium in our diet, whether that be maybe oat milk, soy milk, almond milk, that aren't necessarily dairy products. But these calcium salts, when you hear something calcify, when I hear that word, I think of something kind of hardening. So the calcium salts and the collagen, this is a solid and rigid matrix. And it's what supports our muscles and helps with movement. Also, it gives us our upright stance and things like that. So bones are pretty important. There's two types of bone. One is compact and the next is spongy. In compact bone, it's made of repeating circular units called osteons, which contain the hard matrix, living cells, and blood vessels. This is kind of the middle part of the bone, and I'm not going to be able to draw it really well here on the Zoom, so bear with me. But bone cells have this kind of like circle on itself, kind of like this, and then there's another cell. Ooh, this is not a great diagram, but essentially they are repeating circular units. These are called osteons. All right, we may have a picture, I believe, in the bone slide for sure. I'm not sure if this slide has it. No, it doesn't. Okay. These make up the shafts of the long bone. The ends of your bone are made up of this spongy lattice work with irregular spaces. This makes up the ends of the long bone. So not only do we have cartilage on the end of our long bone, we have this spongy kind of lattice work, so kind of intertwined web-like, and it makes up kind of this ability to have some compression, okay? So what that means here is this is your compact bone up here, and this is where your blood vessels are found and where your red bone marrow is produced. This is going to be much more structured, very stable. Obviously, maybe you've watched some sports games before, and I hate to say it, but you hear that kind of dreaded crack of somebody, you know, breaking their ankle or breaking their leg or things like that. That would be the compact bone. Your spongy bone down here essentially looks like a sponge. It helps absorb the impact, all right? And then also we have that cartilage down here as well. So as we get older, obviously that could kind of degrade a little bit, and that affects walking, exercising, things like that. Something interesting about your spongy bone is that it does change over time. So if you're somebody who would be considered, let's say you consider yourself an athlete and you like to run a lot. Let's say you maybe aren't an athlete and you don't really run a lot. If you decided to switch, saying that you were an athlete and maybe you kind of reduced the amount of working out you would do, your spongy bone would adapt to what your body is kind of needing. It doesn't adapt over a day. It doesn't adapt in an hour. But if you kind of are a regular athlete, your spongy bone will kind of incorporate itself to the gait in which you're walking or running, for that example. It also happens like if you've ever had an injury, such as like you twisted your ankle when you were walking down the stairs, and then you had to wear a boot around your ankle. And so now your gait in which you're walking may be a little bit different. You maybe have a limp. Over some time or some weeks, your spongy bone will also adjust itself for your new gait in which that you walk. And what gait means essentially is like your stride in which you're walking or running or things like that. So that's an interesting fact about your spongy bone. Your spongy bone in combination with your cartilage, your ligaments, and your joints allows for the impact. It's also why knee injuries are fairly common, especially in impact sports, such as football, soccer, things like that. And while baseball, volleyball have a lot of like shoulder, softball, like shoulder and elbow injuries. A lot where that impact is happening is where you'll see that injury. The next is fluid connective tissue. So we've had fibrous connective tissue, supportive connective tissue, and now we have fluid connective tissue. And the two different types of fluid connective tissue are lymph and blood. Your blood is made up of three formed elements: your red blood cells. If you ever see the acronym RBC, that stands for red blood cell. And if you ever see the acronym WBC, that stands for white blood cell. Your red blood cells are what we've been looking a lot at in class. They look like a frisbee kind of with a little indent on the top. They carry oxygen to your extremities. If you've ever heard of somebody being anemic or being iron deficient, this has something to do with the hemoglobin on their red blood cells. So when you are anemic, you're iron deficient. Fe stands for iron. And you have these molecules on your red blood cells called hemoglobin. And you need iron to attach the hemoglobin to attach to the oxygen. So that's also why somebody who's anemic, they probably found out if they were exercising or if they were, walking vigorously and they started to get really lightheaded or dizzy. I know someone in my life who was anemic, and it's kind of a struggle for a little while because you don't know what's wrong. You maybe have some sort of like blacking out in your eyes, kind of that tunnel vision. It's just because your red blood cells are not getting oxygen to their extremities as well as they could for someone who was not iron deficient. So lacking in iron means that you're lacking in the amount of oxygen that you can get to your extremities. It may kind of cause like a numbing, tingly feeling in your fingers and toes. It happens to be a little bit more common in females or people with uteruses because of the menstrual cycle. It's not uncommon in males, but it tends to be more common in people with menstrual cycles. White blood cells, leukocytes, these are the cells that fight off infection. There's different types of white blood cells, and luckily in this class we don't memorize those or anything, but just know that if you see a white blood cell, you have less white blood cells in your system than you do red blood cells, and these white blood cells, they fight off infection, which is great. You probably have had infections in your body that you didn't really have any symptoms for because your white blood cells can attack them. But then there's, some infections that come into your body, maybe a cold or a flu or COVID or anything like that. Your white blood cells are trying to fight against those things. And sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. And there's different types of white blood cells that do different things. So that's kind of just a really general, vague statement to know that white blood cells fight off infections. And then finally, your blood is made up of platelets. And these are pieces of cells that clot blood. And this is important because if you're ever to get a paper cut on your finger or trip and fall on the sidewalk and scrape your knee, unless you're taking blood thinners, your body will naturally clot the area that was wounded, which is great. You lose too much blood, you're going to have to go to the hospital and get a blood transfusion. And we don't want that, right? If we get a paper cut and it's kind of bleeding a little bit, you're maybe told to put some pressure on it or put a bandage on it. Eventually, your body will use the platelets to kind of rush to that area and clot the blood. Now, sometimes people with heart disease or people older in life will have issues with this because they're getting clots in areas that you don't want to get clots in. So that's when somebody would maybe take a blood thinner. You would take a blood thinner if you had like a high blood pressure or low blood pressure. It just depends on the dosage and what it's for. But this clotting essentially can prevent oxygen from your red blood cells getting to your heart, getting to your brain. Somebody who maybe had a heart attack or a stroke, and preventative measures would maybe take a blood thinner. But platelets are a good thing for when we like scrape our knee on the sidewalk or get a paper cut. They help us from essentially bleeding too much. All right, here's just a cartoon description. As you can see, these little things are called the white blood cells, and all of these are all white blood cells. You can see that they're different because of the nucleus on the inside. This one has a circle nucleus. This one has a circle nucleus. This one kind of looks like a lima bean up here. This one has kind of 3 different lobes on the nucleus. Those are all different types of white blood cells, and they do different things, but for this class, we're not going to worry about that. These little kind of jelly bean looking things over here are called platelets, and the red discs are the red blood cells. Your plasma, which a lot of people know plasma because you go to the BioLife or LifeServe and you donate plasma. Plasma is this thing that surrounds or forms all of the units that we talked about. Your plasma is made up of water and protein, which is why if you go donate plasma, they encourage you to eat a high protein diet that day, stay hydrated. Some people either don't have a plasma deficiency in their body, or they have immuno deficiency, so they can't fight off infections as well. That's what plasma is donated for. So when people say plasma saves lives, it does. So donating plasma is really important. Next, we have lymph. Lymph, it's kind of hard to say. I'm glad I'm not wearing a mask, because last semester when I had to say lymph while wearing a mask, it's pretty difficult. But lymph is the white blood cells that congregate in the lymph nodes, and it allows for fighting off infections. It helps from preventing you to get sick. So that's only the little tidbit we need to know about lymph. So before I move on to muscle tissue, let's review the connective tissue that we talked about here. And I will clear all of the drawings. So first we have connective tissue. And the different types of connective tissue were the fibrous connective tissue, supportive, and fluid. Of those different types, you had dense and loose. For fibrous, supportive, we had bone and cartilage. Fluid, we had blood and lymph. Okay, that's a little bit about connective tissue. Now we're going to move on to muscle tissue, and we're going to talk about the different types of muscle tissue. I'm going to keep it in the same order of the PowerPoint here, so I'm going to wait. The first one that we need to know about muscle tissue is skeletal muscle tissue, but let's talk about kind of what muscle tissue is used for. It allows for movement in the body, which seems pretty self-explanatory, right? I'm using the muscles in my facial expressions and the muscles in my hands and my legs all day long. I'm talking right now, I'm using muscles. They're made up of muscle fibers and cells and protein fibers called actin and myosin. There are 3 types of muscle tissue in humans. The first one is skeletal tissue. I would consider this one to be the most common. I would maybe say that cardiac muscle tissue is the second most common. And the one that people don't think about much is your smooth muscle tissue. And we'll talk about that in the next coming slides. So your skeletal muscle tissue, it looks like long cylindrical cells, meaning kind of like columns, and it has multiple nuclei and it's striated fibers. It kind of has a stripe appearance. And here's a couple of pictures right here. This is the skeletal muscle. We know that because it's striped, it's long. These are the types of bones that are, muscle tissue that's attached to bones for movement. Think of your hamstrings, your quadriceps, your gastrocnemius, your bicep, your tricep, all of those. Those are all attached to different bones that provide movement. So every step that I take, my quad muscle is contracting, my hamstring muscle is flexing, and as I move along, they have kind of like a dynamic movement. The muscle tissue is moving so that we can move the bone, okay? The nature of this is called voluntary movement. And what voluntary movement means is that I have to kind of think about this one, right? I have to kind of have a cognitive behavior of saying, okay, I'm going to go walk to the refrigerator now. Even though you may not think that in your brain, or maybe you do, your body has to tell the skeletal muscles essentially what to do, okay? There's a couple of other examples where the nature is involuntary, which means that you don't have to think about it, which this is very helpful, right? After every time you eat some food, you don't have to say, okay, stomach, it's time to digest the food now. You don't have to do that. The smooth muscle in the walls of your hollow organs and vessels allows for your body to do this without you having a cognitive behavior of it. This is called smooth muscle tissue, but also your cardiac muscle tissue is involuntary. Your smooth muscle tissue, it has the appearance of spindle-shaped cells. It has one nucleus and lacks the striations. So if you look at the picture before, the skeletal muscle, you can tell what it looks like because of the stripes. This one, it looks a little bit longer as a single nucleus. Okay, this is on the walls of your hollow organs and your vessels. So I think of like my small intestine, my large intestine, my stomach, all made up of smooth muscle tissue, my lungs. Even though sometimes you have to remind yourself to take a deep breath, most of the time I'm not thinking about breathing, which is really kind of helpful, right? My lungs are expanding and contracting for myself so I can think about what I'm talking about for lecture. That's also made up of smooth muscle tissue. This is called involuntary movement. Okay, voluntary movement is the opposite of involuntary movement. I think of it like when you volunteer to do something, maybe you're going to volunteer at the food bank, you somewhat made a choice to show up there and work. Involuntary movement is the opposite of that. You don't need to make a choice for this smooth muscle tissue to work. The next one, we're also thankful that it's involuntary movement. It's called the cardiac muscle tissue. And this is like you think it is, it's found in the heart. And while maybe you're a little anxious sometimes and your heart is racing and you've got something going on, you're like thinking about that heartbeat, your heart is beating without you telling it to, which is really cool. The appearance of the cardiac muscle tissue is branched cells. It has a single nucleus, which is similar to the smooth muscle tissue. It also has striations, which is similar to the skeletal muscle tissue, but it has darker striations called intercalculated discs that are between the cells. You can't really see them very well, but they're kind of right here. Those are called the intercalculated discs. So the way you can tell the three muscle tissues apart is by their shape, their function, and their location. The next part is nervous tissue, but before we move on to nervous tissue, let us review the different types of muscle cells. All right, the first one is that skeletal muscle. This is found in the ends of long bones. This is like your quads, your hamstrings, your bicep, things like that. Those are skeletal muscles. They help with movement. The next one was smooth muscle tissue. This is on the walls of your hollow organs. It's found in like your stomach and your lungs. And finally, we had the cardiac muscle tissue. This is what's allowing your heart to pump blood to the rest of the body. It's found in your heart. Okay, we're next going to talk about the nervous tissue, and we'll talk a little bit about that right now. Your nervous tissue allows for communication between cells and through sensory input, integrated data, and motor output. This is what allows for your sensations, your feeling, the things that your senses are doing, okay? So for example, if I look at my water cup, I have a red straw. In order for me to identify that, my eyes had to communicate with my brain, which then communicated with my mouth to tell you that it was a red straw. Okay, this allows for communication. Sensory input. I had to visualize that red straw. I could also feel the cold water on my hand. Okay, these are all sensory inputs. We also can have motor outputs from the nervous tissue. What that means is, I give the example of when you maybe were a little kid and you probably couldn't read yet, and the stove was hot, and your parents or your guardians or whoever said, don't touch the stove, it's really hot, and you didn't believe them, and you put your hand on the stove. And then your biological response of your nervous tissue is your hand had sensation that it was too hot. It communicated with your brain and said, pull your hand off the stove, and you pull it off. I mean, I do it now, right? I go to wash the dishes and I turn up the dishwater too hot, and I put my hand under there, and my initial reaction is to pull my hand away. I didn't have to tell myself to pull the hand away. That's a nervous tissue reaction that helps protect our body. You can think of it as like when you accidentally step on something that's too sharp, like you accidentally step on a nail, or you're walking on gravel rocks or things like that. Your initial reaction, that motor output, is a nervous tissue reaction. The different types of cells in the nervous tissue are called neurons and neuroglia. The neurons are a little bit more common, so let's talk about them first. You've maybe seen a picture of a neuron before. If you haven't, this is a neuron, and it's pretty important. It's important because it makes up all communication channels in our body. The middle part is called the cell body, and that cell body kind of looks essentially like the middle part of a tree. Right here, cell body. The little branching on the outside, this is the dendrite. This is how information is given to this neuron. Then the information leaves that cell body through the axon, right here. The axon is covered in a myelin sheath. Those kind of looks like a bunch of marshmallows on top of each other, which I kind of highlighted over, so I apologize. And that's how other neurons communicate to each other. So there'd be another neuron down here. Here's the dendrites again, and it would kind of have this like branch-like substance. It kind of looks like a tree or a lightning bolt. And that's how they communicate to each other. The parts that I would really focus on here are knowing what the cell body is. It's in the middle. The dendrites give the information in. The axon is how they transfer to another neuron. The other way to think about this is the game telephone. If you ever played that when you were a kid, or I guess you can play it now, that's fine too, where you sit in a group of people and somebody starts and they whisper in your ear a message or a phrase. And then the next person goes and they whisper and they try to communicate that message. Our brain is a little bit better than the game telephone, but that's essentially how the neurons are communicating to each other kind of down the path. And it's not just like there's one neuron in my hand and there's another in my wrist and in my elbow. There's millions of neurons, or nerve endings, if you've ever heard of that before, that are in my hands, feet, back, neck, everywhere. You have nerve endings because they help protect your body and they help communicate to your brain. That response of me pulling my hand off the stove is my brain's way of protecting my body because it doesn't want my hand to burn off, essentially. So like it says, the cell body and dendrites and axons, the dendrites carry information towards that cell, the axons carry information away from that cell body. I think neurons are pretty cool. They are a collection of cells that support and nourish the neurons. These are called the neuroglia. And they outnumber neurons 9-1. Okay, so neuroglia are essentially like the support system to the nervous tissue. The different types of the neuroglia are the microglia, the ogliodendrocyte, the astrocyte are the ones that I just highlighted there. Those are called neuroglia. They just support the neurons, and they outnumber neurons 9-1. So there's a lot more neuroglia than there are neurons. This is a neuron. Remember the cell body, the nucleus, the dendrites, the myelin sheath, the axon, how they communicate to each other. All right, so we did the nervous tissue. So let's add it to our list here if you're following along. The first one would be the neurons. These are made up of axons, dendrites, cell body, and the myelin sheath. I think I spelled that right. And we have their neuroglia. There's a couple of different types of neuroglia. You guys don't need to necessarily memorize the types of neuroglia, just know that there's different types of nervous tissue. All right, we're on to the last, connective tissue. We're going to talk a little bit more after we go through all this about the skin cancer and things like that, but this is the last type of tissue, our fourth one, 4 out of 4. The epithelial tissue is a group of cells that forms a tight, continuous network, and it lines the body's cavities, covers its surfaces, and it's found in glands. Glands are like your thyroid gland or your pituitary gland. They're different types of glands. They're made up of epithelial tissue. The cells are anchored in the basement membrane. So essentially what this means is that how your cells are connected to each other can be through a basement membrane. I think of a basement membrane as like your basement in your house. And maybe if you're not from Iowa, maybe you didn't grow up with a basement, but basements are fairly common here. We have tornadoes, so people like to have basements in that case. But a basement membrane essentially is that yellow part, and I believe I have a picture coming up. And then we have different cells. These are the nucleus of the cells. And that basement membrane is epithelial tissue. It's that yellow part right there. So that is how kind of cells are anchored into each other. You can see that in skin cells as well, and we'll talk about that. They're named after their appearance of cell layers and cell shape. So there's different types of epithelial tissue, and we'll talk about that. Some of them are layered, like this. My drawing is not that great, I really apologize. There's better pictures coming up here. There's also transitional epithelium that changes in appearance in response to tension. Okay, so here's a much better drawing than what I was doing. This is how they name epithelial tissue. So the first thing is the number of layers. So if you have one layer of cells, it's called simple. If you have more than one layer, it's called stratified, which this would be, that would be an example of pseudostratified. I'm looking for an example of stratified. Here's an example down here of stratified. Okay, you can see that there's more than one layer. And then pseudostratified, it appears to have multiple layers, but it's actually only one. This one is a pseudostratified, so it looks like there's 2 layers. It looks like there's a layer here and a layer here, but when you actually look at the basement membrane, they're all in line with each other. So pseudo, meaning kind of like fake or pretend. Simple, meaning one layer. Stratified, more than one layer. You can then name the type of epithelial tissue by the shape of the cell. So you can name it cuboidal, which kind of looks like the word cubed. Columnar, kind of looks like columns. And squamous, which looks like flattened. I think of like when you squash something, when you squish it down. So here's a couple examples of those. This first one up here is called simple squamous. It's called simple squamous because there's a single layer, which is right here. You can see that, right? There's a basement membrane, and then there's one layer. The next thing we look at is their shape, and it kind of looks flattened. So that's why it's called simple squamous. This is lining of the lungs, the blood vessels, and it helps protect. Next, you have are simple cuboidal. So here, again, we have one layer. I know it's one layer because there's the basement membrane, and here's the layer. Although it kind of curves around the outside, it is one layer. The next I look at is the shape, and it's called simple cuboidal. And these look like little squares or cubes. You can tell the difference between these two because of their shape, but they both have a single layer. The next one here is a simple columnar. So you can look at the shape. It is one layer. Here's that basement membrane. There's the one layer. And they're columnar because of how upright they are. They look like columns. You can find this in the lining of the small intestine, the oviducts, and it helps absorb nutrients. The next one is called pseudostratified ciliated columnar, which is really cool to say if you want to try that sometime. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar. This is the lining of the trachea, which is in your throat. It helps sweep impurities towards that. It has cilia, which is why it's called ciliated. Remember, cilia are those hair-like kind of structures on the top. Pseudostratified, meaning it looks like it could be two layers, but it's actually one. And then columnar because of how up and down they are. And lastly, we have stratified squamous. Stratified meaning there's more than one layer. As you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 layers if my vision is correct today. And then squamous is because they are kind of squished down and flattened. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between squamous and cuboidal. And what I would like to kind of say about that is to look at the nucleus. So you can see here in the cuboidal ones that the nuclei are kind of all in line with each other, where the squamous, they're kind of flattened as well. Okay, so what is the integumentary system? Let's add to our list first before I move on. Epithelial tissue. We have, so you have the shape and the number of layers, and that's how you can kind of tell the difference between those. First is the shape. It can be cuboidal, it can be columnar, and it can be squamous. I probably spelled those wrong, and I apologize. I'm just trying to briefly review. And the number of layers, it can be simple, it can be pseudo stratified, meaning it kind of looks like it's going to have 2 layers, but it's not, and then stratified. All right, so those are the 4 different types of connective tissue and a little bit about each of those. The integumentary system, this includes the skin, the accessory organs such as your hair, skin and nails, your glands. This is the 2 main regions of your integumentary system are your epidermis and your dermis. Under the skin, there's a subcutaneous layer between the dermis and the internal structures where fat is stored. We'll show a picture of that coming up here. And it's important for maintaining homeostasis. So there are 4 functions to the integumentary system. It helps protect the body from physical trauma, invasion of pathogens, and water loss. Think about this. Your skin can help, when you bump up against something, it's not going to damage your internal organs. Your skin might be damaged or bruised, but it does protect us against physical trauma, invasion of pathogens. That's why most of us have to wear masks when we come into the classroom or you're in the dining hall, because it's kind of a couple of entryways where pathogens can enter. Whereas you're not just going to get COVID if you touch it on your arm, but then if you wipe your nose and you touch your eyes, that's how it can come into your body. But your integumentary system, it helps with some of the invasion of pathogens. And then also water loss. Aren't we glad that when we take a drink of water, that it doesn't just shoot out of my body? The skin helps kind of maintain that. It helps for prevention of water loss. It helps regulates body temperature. So if any of you go outside without a coat today, first of all, you're crazy. It also you'll maybe start to shiver. It helps from keeping your internal organs from freezing, but also when you're super hot, maybe on a hot day or you were working out or something like that, it provides you with sweat that helps cool off your skin. It's providing ways for homeostasis to be maintained, and we'll talk about that. It allows us to be aware of our surroundings through sensory receptors. So when you feel something too hot or too cold, when you touch something that's soft or hot or hard or soft or sharp or things like that. I think I said soft twice. All of those sensory receptors are what allows us to kind of either protect our body, communicate with our brain, or have some sort of experience. And then it synthesizes chemicals such as melanin and vitamin D. Melanin giving kind of that more pigmented color of the skin, and vitamin D helping process kind of like the sunlight. It's also known that people who live in Iowa over the winter months lack in vitamin D because we don't go outside very much. All right, so the two regions we talked about are the epidermis and the dermis. We don't really need to memorize this picture at all, but just kind of give you a reference of where we're at. So this could be your arm, it could be your head, any part of skin where you have hair. There's your hair shaft, okay? Your hair then comes down to the hair root down here. You have different nerve endings. Here's a nerve ending. This is a sensory receptor. Here's another sensory receptor. You've got arteries and veins. Arteries are going to be the red color. Veins are blue or purple. You have some more nerves down here. You have some adipose tissue or fat. You have a hair follicle, which essentially wraps around the hair root. You have an oil gland, which is kind of right here next to your hair follicle. And you have a sweat pore right here. And there's also some stem cells in the layers. Your epidermis is kind of that first top layer. Your dermis is kind of where the hair follicles are found, some nerve endings and blood vessels. And then you have that subcutaneous layer, also known as the hypodermis. Okay. Some things I'd like to notice essentially are the sweat glands, the sweat pore, the hair shaft, where the adipose tissue is, and the nerve endings. The epidermis is that top layer. It's thin, the outermost layer of the skin. It's what you can see on your hand right now. And yes, the myth is true. All of this skin on my hand is actually dead skin cells. But if you ever have like a hangnail on your finger, things like that, and you maybe like pick the skin off your cuticle or anything like that, which is a bad habit, don't do that. But you'll be able to see kind of more of like a more of that pigmented color underneath. That would not be dead skin cells. So all across the top of your skin is dead skin cells. And that's also why some skincare professionals will be like, exfoliate your skin, things like that. It helps kind of that turnover rate of your skin. You get new skin cells every 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from now, I will have some new skin. But also I don't shed like a snake. So your skin cells are regenerating and they have a 2-week turnover, but it's not like all at one time. Your skin is all at different parts in its cell life. So, but there is a kind of a quick turnover of that skin cells. It helps with growth. It helps with kind of hygiene and keeping the body clean and things like that. Let's see here. The cells in the uppermost layers are dead, like I said, and they become filled with keratin, thus acting as a waterproof barrier, which is great, right? It's also why if you take a shower or a bath, you don't just like absorb all the water. We're thankful for that. The Langerhans cells are the type of white blood cells that help fight off pathogens. You can find those in the epidermis. Melanocytes they produce the melanin that can lend to skin color and protection from UV light. This is a little bit where we get into the skin cancer piece, because there is a certain amount of UV light that our skin can take. And what I mean by take is that it's not like you walk outside and you instantly get sun damage or skin cancer. Now, we all maybe know of a friend or things like that who maybe have like more pale skin, kind of like a peachier, whiter skin. And those are known to be the people that are very sun sensitive. And that doesn't necessarily mean about their melanocytes or how much melanin they produce. It's more so what the UV light in their skin can, I keep saying the word take, but essentially the threshold in which the UV light can be broken down. So if too much UV comes in, maybe there's like a sunburn or things like that, or somebody used a sun tanning bed, the UV light can essentially damage the skin. The melanocytes that produce melanin maybe aren't working in a correct way, or they kind of have a malfunction of some sort. And then the growing and reproducing of those cells is kind of what leads to skin cancer. Some cells convert cholesterol to vitamin D. Vitamin D is a vitamin that we need to, kind of live. It can help with boosting your mood, so in a positive way. So if you're ever having a bad day, go outside, get some vitamin D. It should help a shift in your mood. The dermis is that thick inner layer of the skin. It's made up of dense fibrous connective tissue, remember, which is opposite of loose fibrous connective tissue. It contains elastic and collagen fibers. It also contains blood vessels and many sensory receptors and glands. I think of this kind of like as the workhorse of the skin, right? We've got the protective layer, and then we've kind of got like the behind the scenes that are really helping us. The blood vessels help us transport oxygen to our extremities, specifically our muscles. Sensory receptors, so that when you touch the hot stove, you can pull, you're communicating with your brain to pull that away so you don't burn your hand. And your glands. Okay, so where are skin cells keratinized? So this is kind of like one of those light micrographs. So remember we talked about that 2D image that we can look at. This one does have some, actually this one has a little bit of a 3D image in my mind, but this is the epidermis. All of this up here is the epidermis. This is your layer of skin cells. Now, if you were to look really, really close to your skin cells, you wouldn't get this view, but you may see some ridges. You may see some hair follicles and things like that. That's what we're looking at right here. Okay, they're all dead skin cells that have been keratinized. And then underneath, those are the cells that are undergoing that keratinization. So I said if you get a hangnail, and you can kind of see that little brighter pigmented part underneath your skin, that is kind of what that color is from. And then we have the dermis, which is that under that epidermis there. Remember, this is where the hair follicles are, the sensory receptors and things like that. So what do we need to know about skin cancer? There's 2 of the 3 types that arise in the epidermis. So the basal cell carcinoma, this is one of the most common yet least deadly forms of skin cancer. So if somebody were to go get like a mole checked out, or like a skin, something on their skin checked out at a dermatologist or at their family doctor, a basal cell carcinoma, it means that it is skin cancer, but most of the time it's not going to affect anything else but the skin. So it is very common. It's not that deadly form of skin cancer. A melanoma is the most deadly form of skin cancer, but it's the least common, which I guess is good. Hopefully it continues to not be very common. And it just depends on the type. There's nothing people can really do besides wearing SPF when they go outside, and protecting themselves from unnecessary UV light, because we have to have some for us to kind of break down some vitamin D, but you don't want too much where the UV light is damaging your skin. So like it says, stay out of the sun between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. We all know that that's I think that's a little far-fetched, because staying out of the sun between those times of the day, that's probably not too enjoyable. But if you have to go outside during that time, wear protective clothing, some different things like a hat or a tight weave or a treated glasses or things like that. Wearing SPF with at least 15 that protects from UVA and UVB rays. They're different types of rays. And it says do not use tanning beds. Those are the ways that you can prevent skin cancer. A little graphic image here, but just to show you different types. So the melanoma, the more deadly one, is on the right-hand side, and the basal cell carcinoma is on the left. You don't need to be a medical professional and identify all of your spots or moles on your arm or anything like that, but just to know kind of what, that they do look different in a sense. All right, this next question is asking, what are the accessory organs of the skin and why are they important? Those accessory organs are nails, hair follicles, oil glands, and sweat glands. They're important for protection, but also supporting. So think about, like, why do we have fingernails? I mean, for people who like to paint their fingernails or get them done, it's kind of fun, but they're actually derived from the epidermis and they offer a protective covering of the fingers. They actually have a function. The hair follicles, they're derived from the dermis, which is that layer under the epidermis. But hair grows in the epidermal cells. The biological reason that humans have hair is to protect our internal organs and accessory glands and things like that of our homeostasis. So what homeostasis means is our body wants to survive and live and maintain equilibrium as much as possible. So when I go outside and I have to walk my dog and it's -4 degrees out, technically the hair on my body, on my arm, on my head, protect my body from heat loss. While it's probably best if I wear a coat and a hat and things like that, it's essentially a biological coat and a hat for me. Your oil glands are associated with hair and produce sebum that lubricates the skin and hair. I don't like that word, but it kind of reflects bacterial growth. What that means is that if there's bacteria on your hands, you can get that from touching a doorknob or using a public water fountain or things like that. It helps kind of to keep those pathogens and that bacteria away from your skin and getting into your internal organs. And then your sweat glands, they're just helping with body temperature. So when you're really hot, maybe they had the heat all the way turned up in the dorm or something, you maybe start to sweat. Your body's way of reacting to make sure that your internal organs don't overheat. It's always good to remember that our body's main goal is to survive and keep equilibrium as much as possible. So now we talked a lot about the tissues, okay? We talked about connective tissue, and we talked about supportive tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. All of these different types of tissues come together to make an organ. So an organ is 2 or more tissue types working towards a particular function. An organ system is a combination of organs that will work together to carry out a particular function. This is really important for understanding, so I'm going to say it one more time. So you have a couple types of tissues that make up an organ. So think of like my lungs. My lungs are made up of smooth muscle tissue, but we also know that they're made up of connective tissue and probably some fibrous connective tissue as well. And it makes up my lungs. And you guys probably have a picture of what lungs look like in your head, kind of 2 peachy kind of looking organs. And they are in combination with other organs such as like my trachea and things like that. My lungs and my esophagus and my trachea help with the respiratory system, meaning that it's how I breathe. So when the organs are working together, they're called an organ system. Or like your digestive system is a really good example of that. You have your esophagus, your stomach, your small and large intestines, and your rectum and your anus that are and your urinary bladder and things like that are providing digestive support throughout your body. Those are all different types of organs. Those organs are made up of tissues, and we just talked a whole lot about tissues, so I'm not going to explain that again right now anyways. But this is a good slide to kind of bring us back to, okay, where are we? All right, there's a couple of different organ systems here listed across the bottom. This is a figure in your book. This is a good one to refer to. Essentially, the question could be, what are some organ systems and how do they maintain homeostasis? You could talk about your integumentary system. That's what we just talked about. That's the one far left. This one protects the body. It provides temperature homeostasis, which means that like when you're too hot or you're too cold, your tegumentary system can kind of sense that and it has some sort of reaction, whether that be shivering or sweating. It can synthesize vitamin D and receive sensory input. The organ that it works with is the skin. There's a couple over here, like your digestive system. You can see that it works with a lot of different organs. Your oral cavity, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Those are just some of them. And how you digest food. And all of those organs are made up of tissues that we just talked about. The organs can be made up of multiple types of tissues. And then all the organs working together are called organ systems. Here's a couple more examples: skeletal system, muscular system, nervous system, endocrine system, reproductive system. These are all in your book, so I'm not going to read every single one of them to you, but just know to reference, this is figure 413, and this talks about each of the organ systems, the organs that are involved, and their functions. There's different body cavities. We don't focus a lot on the anatomy and physiology of this, but I think that the names kind of give it away. You have your cranial cavity, which kind of makes sense. Cranial contains your brain. You've got your vertebral cavity, which is kind of down here, which contains your spinal cord. These cavities are essentially spaces in which the organs are found. So your thoracic cavity, which is kind of up here in the chest and rib area, it contains your heart and your lungs and your esophagus. The space around that is called a cavity, and in specific, that one's called the thoracic cavity. You have your abdominal cavity, which contains your stomach, your liver, your spleen, pancreas, gallbladder, intestines, etc. And as you can see, there's other types of cavities, such as your pelvic cavity, and what it contains, being your reproductive organs, abdominal cavity, your digestive organs, etc. So what about the body membranes that line the cavities? So we have all those different cavities, and what are those cavities made of? They're made up of a couple of different membranes. Mucosous membranes that line the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive systems. Then you have the serous membranes that line the lungs, heart, and abdominal cavity, and cover the internal organs. They're most likely named after the location. So pleura means lungs. The petronium is the abdominal cavity and organs, and the pericardium is the heart. Cardi, like cardium, not Cardi B. Pleura, lungs. They're named after where they're at, essentially. So this is what the cavities are made up of. You also have things called synovial membranes. This lines the cavities of the freely movable joints, such as your shoulder and your leg and hip joint. Your meninges cover the brain and spinal cord. So this is what we're talking about here on the inside of all these cavities. What are these cavities made of? And they're made of all of these different things, different types of membranes and the meninges. We've mentioned a word called homeostasis a couple of times. And this word essentially means how can our body stay relatively constant when internally when the external environment is a little bit different. Luckily for us, our body makes up a lot of adjustments all day long, and you don't necessarily have to be conscious about them, which is really great. The nervous and endocrine systems are key in maintaining homeostasis, meaning that your nervous system communicates to your brain. So if I accidentally touch something that was really sharp, like a knife, I'll most likely pull my hand away or drop the knife down because I don't want to cut my hand. Your nervous system and your endocrine system, like your skin, are communicating to each other to protect your body. Another big one is like body temperature, and body temperature being affected, like when you go outside and it's super cold, your body can recognize that without you telling it that it's super cold, and that, oh, there it goes, my camera. Recognizing that it's super cold, and your body will then start to shiver. Your muscles will contract, your teeth may chatter a little bit, and that's your body's way of having a reaction to maintaining this relatively constant internal environment. Your body wants your heart to beat, it wants your lungs to breathe. Those are the main goals of your body, and it has to work at a certain temperature that's efficient. And it says changes from the normal tolerance limits result in illness or even death. So our body's main goal is to survive. Here's a couple of ways that homeostasis is maintained. Again, I'm not going to read all of these to you, but let's talk about that endocrine system because we talked a lot about that today. The endocrine glands secrete hormones which can also regulate and coordinate the activities of other systems, and it works more slowly than the nervous system. So think about like your fight or flight. When you have an adrenaline rush of some sort, maybe you're playing a video game, or maybe you're in an intense sports game, or maybe some of you would have an adrenaline rush for an exam, okay? The hormones that are being sent to your body, they work a little bit slower than the nervous system. Think about how fast a nervous system has to work. It has to communicate immediately. For hormones, it's pretty quick, but they're secreted and they regulate and coordinate activities of other systems, and they work slowly in the nervous system. What our fight or flight kind of reaction is to protect our body. It was known back in the day, like if you or your ancestors were invaded in some sort, they would either fight or flight away, or essentially get rid of or leave the situation. You may feel this as well if you're ever having like an argument with someone, a significant other, a sibling. You either are going to sit there and fight it out if there's something about it, or you're going to, remove yourself from the situation. And that's our body's way of protecting ourselves, which seems silly, right? You're having an argument with your significant other. You shouldn't feel threatened, hopefully. Like your body shouldn't feel like it's going to be threatened in any way. But it's a reaction that's biological because of the hormones, because your body thinks that it's going to be threatened in some way. Kind of an interesting topic. The cardiovascular system, nervous system, they all work together to maintain a constant internal environment for your body. That's what homeostasis means. What are the mechanisms for maintaining homeostasis? We've got positive and negative feedback. All right, got a couple more slides here, so stay with me. We've got negative feedback. This is the output that the system resolves or corrects the original stimulus. And positive feedback brings about an increasing change in the same direction as the original stimulus. I'm going to give an example that has nothing to do with biology, then I'm going to give you a biological example. Think about it. I'm a soccer coach, so I'm at practice and I want to correct something. The person I'm coaching just keeps kicking the soccer ball out of bounds, okay? I can give different types of feedback. Maybe you guys have heard of negative feedback. I could yell and yell and yell, and I could try and correct it, right? I'm not a yeller. I'm not a yelling type of coach. But I could say things like, hey, Timmy or Susie or whoever I'm coaching, try and do this and correct what you're doing in that instance. Positive feedback, maybe somebody just scored a goal in a soccer game, and I continue to just give positive feedback. I'm not correcting anything, but I'm giving some sort of feedback in the same direction in which it's going. It's like, wow, you did great. You're so super duper cool. All of those things. Okay, so that's a little bit about like negative and positive feedback. In biology, we talk about a couple of examples. First of all, negative feedback wants to correct the primary thing that's wrong. Okay, so the components of that is there's a sensor and a control center. Your control center is most likely your brain. Your sensor is most likely something on your skin. For example, if you go outside and it's super cold, I'm using that example a lot today, but if you go outside and it's super cold, you start to kind of get off balance here in homeostasis. Your body's like, ooh, that's a little bit too cold. I like to be at 98.6, and this is colder than 98.6. So what your body does is it reacts to that stimulus. It feels that stimulus. It produces a sensation that sends data to your brain. I'm going to try and draw a brain. There's your brain stem. Okay. Your brain then says, oh, start to chatter your teeth and shake your body. And that negative feedback, it should return your body temperature back to normal to an extent. Your muscles are contracting and creating heat, same within your face. And it creates that normal, or it corrects to that normal stimuli and corrects the problem. Okay, that's called a negative feedback loop. It's essentially directing right to the problem and fixing it and creating a solution. So here's that example of body temperature. This is also in your book. I kind of just went through it, so I'm going to skip ahead to the positive feedback loop. Positive feedback is an increase of the change of the internal environment in one direction. One of the most common or most well-known ways of positive feedback loop is during labor. So an example is the secretion of oxytocin during labor or birth to continually increase the uterine contractions. So your body, I say your, but the hypothetical person is having labor or wants to deliver a baby, and the oxytocin, which is a hormone, creates the uterine contractions to essentially deliver the baby. And it's going to send those oxytocin signals until the baby is delivered, and sometimes a little bit after. But that's not sending it to the correct location. It's not sending a certain dosage of oxytocin and it corrects itself and it comes back to normal. This is like all in the same direction. It can also be harmful when a fever is too high and continues to rise. So a fever is our body's way of reacting to some sort of pathogen or infection. We increase our body temperature in order to fight off that infection or invading substance to hopefully kill essentially the germs, bacteria, virus, whatever that is. That's kind of what a fever can maybe stem from. Not always, but that's when it can be harmful because our body is like, let's kill this foreign substance. Let's kill it, let's kill it, let's kill it. And it's kind of increasing a fever in the positive feedback loop. And if it gets too high, that's where it can be a little dangerous. So this is all in the same direction feedback loop called positive. It's not really a loop. It's more of an arrow. So you've got your negative feedback loop. That's kind of like going in a circle, essentially. And then you have your positive feedback loop, which is all in one direction. All right. We made it to the end here. Were there any questions that I could answer about the material, about the setup of class, about your assignments?
When we do have our exam, we don't have class that day, right? Okay.
Yep, you can do your exam at your own time in your own space. If you need a specific testing area, you can go through pathogens, or we can set something up in the science center if you'd like. Just let me know ahead of time. And that just goes for anybody, hypothetically.
You mean pathways?
Did I say pathogens?
Yeah.
It's time for us to do that. Yeah, pretty soon. I'm talking about pathogens so much. I meant pathways. Thank you.
Just a quick question. I haven't seen a portal for our second chapter 3 section on my Wartburg. Do we have that, or was that what our video on Wednesday was for?
I guess I don't really know what you're asking.
So like with our lectures, we normally have our post assignments that are due on the next lecture day.
Yeah.
But I don't see a portal on my Wartburg for that for today.
All right, let me double check that. Does yours, and I don't know, did they do something new to my Wartburg? Did you guys notice that? It's like different setup. I can't make an analysis of it yet because I haven't spent too much time on it. All right, Ezra, does yours look like this? Maybe.
Yep, there it is. Okay, it must have just had opened up, I guess. So.
Okay. And like I said, I probably did something new to my Wartburg, so it probably took a second more than usual. I normally have them open at like noon on the day of. So if you checked at like 10 a.m. today, it wouldn't have been there.
Another question, just for the lockdown browser, that's something that we're gonna have to like go to the App Store and download, right?
I haven't had to do it on your half of that, but I believe when you go to take the exam, it would give you an option to download that. Anybody want to kind of touch on that, what it looks like on your guys' side?
So pretty much when you enter that test, it has a thing where you can test to see whether or not you have the lockdown browser. And if you don't, it'll tell you, and then you can download it from there. If you download it once, you won't need to download it ever again. You should be good for later on. So it's gonna be there when you take the test that day. Just make sure you have it and make sure that before you take the test, I mean, every single window except that one should be closed, or else it will take you out right away.
Okay, so I want to add, I had Bechtel last semester, and he used the portal, all the lockdown browser all the time, so I'm guessing that I should be good then because we use it all the time.
Yep, it should be the same one.
Yeah, I had him too last semester, so you should be good.
Okay.
All right. Well, I don't hear any questions initially.